Welcome back to the Foundation C# course. We're currently in Module 6, and this lesson will be covering events. Events is something that we use a lot, especially in UI projects. So if you've ever started off with the Windows form demonstration or tutorial, which is a really common one to start with, notice I have not started with that, but if you ever start with that, you've seen things like a button click event, where you click the button and something happens. It runs some code. We're going to learn what events are in this lesson, how to create those type of events, which will then also prepare you when you do look at those user interfaces, because you'll understand what's happening behind the scenes with those events. So if something goes wrong, you'll know why and how to work with it. Let's go over to Visual Studio. Students equals new list of string. And then, and actually that should be let's make it a private list of string. And then we're going to have a private list of string called the waiting list. So what's going to happen is we're going to have a maximum number of students that we can add to any one course. So when you create a class, you have to pass in a few things. The title and the maximum students. And that'll be for the enrollment. And so we'll have properties for those, just read only and private rights, or private sets. So prop, this is going to be title, course title, and it'll be a private set, so you can't change it later. But as long as the enrolled student count is less than the maximum students, then we are going to add that student to the list. So enrolled students add student name. Now we're also going to do a check here. I'm going to put a comment here. Check to see if we are maxed out, meaning there's no more spots open in the enrollment section, and now you have to move people to the waiting list. Now we're going to do an else here and say waiting list dot add student name. So if they're not going to be enrolled, we'll add them to the waiting list. And then we should also get that output. So string output equals empty string to start. And then here what we'll do is we will say output equals, let's do our $sign first, and say student name was added to the, was enrolled in, and we'll put the name of the class, which is course title. And we'll copy this and we'll paste it here. And we'll say instead of enrolled, was added to the wait list in that course. And then either way, we'll return output. So now we have this method that allows us to sign up students. So if we come up here, we can create a couple of different instances of college class model. So college class model, let's call it history equals new college class model. Notice you have to pass the title and the number of students in. So history 101 and the max number of students, let's just say it's 3. We're going to keep these low because this is a demo and I don't want to have to over and over and over again type new students. Next, what we'll do is say college class model math equals new college class model. And let's say calculus 101. Well, let's do 201 because harder. And only 2 students can sign up for that course. So now we can say is history dot sign up student, and we can add some people, and then history dot sign up students again, and let's add some more. Let's go all the way until we're into the waiting list, which that means 4 students at least. So let's put 5 in just to be sure. There we go. So there's 5 students for the history course, which only can take 3. And then we'll just take these 3 again, and we'll add them to the math class, which can only take 2. So we run this right now. It doesn't do anything, which is interesting because we're not actually printing any of these things out. We should have. So let's do this. Instead of, no, I'll keep it this way. I want to keep it, I want to print out the console here. That's a little messy, especially if I want that to go into a class library. So what we'll do is let's use a thing we learned from the last lesson, which is public static class console helpers. And I'll make it a public static void that is print to console. This string message, and just say console write line message. Pretty simple stuff. What that allows me to do is come up here and say print to console on the end of each of these instead of wrapping them in a console write line and making it a little messier. This way it's a little more fluent. So history class, sign a student up, and then print that to the console. Math class, sign them up, and then print that to the console. Now let's run this again, and this time it enrolls the first 3 people, and then it says Mary Jones was added to the wait list, and so was Sandy Patty. For calculus, Sue and Joe were added, but then Mary was added to the wait list again. So Mary gets added to the wait list a lot, it seems like. Poor Mary. So with that being said, that's all well and good, but how about we find out when we switch over? When you hit this last entry here, how about we alert the user that there is a change and now that's full, we need to go to the wait list. So let's close this out and we'll move on to figure out how events work. Because right now, nothing here is event driven. We're just saying send back information. Now what events allow us to do is to signal that state has changed. Think back to that very first tutorial you probably did with WinForms, where you clicked the button and something happened. That event for the button click, what it's saying is something has changed. The button has been clicked. In our case, we don't have buttons. This is a console. But that's good because it allows us to see events as they are, not get hidden behind UI. What we're going to do it to be, but it's going to be the information we send back to whoever's listening for these events. So for now, we're just going to start really simple and just say string. We could create an entire object or model and send it back through this, but we're going to say string. And now we give it a name. So this is the event name. So let's go give it a name of enrollment full. This is going to get fired when the enrollment is full. Now what this is it's kind of the glue that holds events together. This is the declaration that this class has an event called enrollment full. Now over here, I can start listening to those events. So for example, I can come down here and say history dot. And notice I have the lightning bolt here for enrollment full. We haven't seen that before. We've been working with the methods here, the purple box, and the properties, which is the kind of white wrench. But now we have this yellow enrollment full event, and that's the yellow lightning bolt. And what this tells us is that this is something that we can listen for. So an event is something that, think of it like we are shouting. So the class, college class model is going to shout, hey, this happened. And then anybody who's listening will hear that and be able to act upon it. So this is we're going to listen for it. So I say history.enrollment full. I put space, and then I can say plus equals, and notice it gives me this ability to hit tab to insert this method. I'm going to hit tab. And what it does, it creates this method called history_enrollment full. So history is from the name of my variable here, history, but it changed the casing to be the proper casing. And then it did an underscore and said enrollment full because it's listening to the enrollment full event. So it's pretty descriptive of what it's doing. This is for history, and it's the enrollment full event. So it created this method down here. It's private, which is interesting. It's private because it's listening to an event from a different class. It's private because of the fact that the actual, what we're doing is we're passing this event through and saying, we're attaching it over here to enrollment full and saying, this is the method I want you to call. So even though it's private, it's actually being called by a different class, which is a little trippy in some ways. But that's the way of doing it. You want to make it private. So it's got two values being passed in. One is here. And that's because we said that the event handler is going to be of type string. So it's going to return a string. And that's whatever message we want to pass in. Now, honestly, we really don't care what that string is for this particular event. Because what really matters is the event is fired. Because when the event is fired, we know that the enrollment is full for history. What we can do is we can capture this and do something with it. Let's just do a console write line and say the enrollment is full for history. We know it's history because it's attached to the history variable. So it's the history class. So that's the listener portion of things. We're going to listen to that event. Remember I said this is the glue that holds events together because there's another side to it, and that's the place where we actually broadcast this is what happened. And that is going to be down here, where we're going to say fire off this enrollment full event. So enrollment full ? Dot invoke. And the reason question mark is because if no one's listening, we don't want to throw an exception, which it would. And so the question mark we've used before says, if it's not null, do this next thing. Now, if it is fired after right here. It's after Sue Storm, but it's actually, oh, look at that. It's firing every time. That's not good. So it's firing before Tim Corey, it's firing before Sue Storm, and it's firing before Joe Smith. Doesn't seem quite right. So let's debug this. But in theory, what's going to happen is it's going to fire, and it's going to be right before the last person is displayed as enrolled. So let's close this down and look at why is fired 3 times. I'm thinking it was the opposite of what I wanted. Actually, it's worse than I thought. So I didn't actually check to see if the enrollment was full. I just fired it every time we enrolled somebody. That's not right. So now what we'll do is we'll do a if enrolled students.count equals maximum students. Then fire out the event. Now the other thing is, let's give a little separation up here to this event. Right here. Just so we have, it's a little easier to see that this event was fired. So let's now run this again. And this time it happens right before Joe Smith. It says enrollment is full for history. Now the reason, again, right before Joe Smith is because Joe Smith hasn't been printed to the console yet when the event is fired. But that tells us a couple of things. First of all, it tells us that we really don't control the timing of events. If we're going to listen to an event, when it fires, it fires. We don't get to control, oh, let's fire it after this happens. That's not really how this works. It fires when state changes. And when state changes, it's going to let us know. And so it let us know that the state changed for history to a full enrollment. Therefore, it printed this message out. Now, it also tells us that even though up here, these all print right in a row, it actually ran this method right on this dot right here. So we signed up Joe Smith, and then it came down here and said enrollment is full, and then it printed out Joe Smith. That's why Joe Smith is down here after the event. So events fire when they happen, and they can interrupt or sit in the middle of the operations that you're doing. They kind of inject themselves in between the cracks. Now also notice that we ran out of room in calculus, but we didn't have any message fired saying anything happened. We also didn't crash our application. So when it came time to fire that event, because that event is in the calculus class as well, because it's the same class, it came in and fire that event, and it said, hey, there's no event handler. Therefore, I won't do anything. Let's change that. Let's also add a console write line after history, just so we have a little bit of separation between the two courses. So we want to fire an event for math as well. So let's come down here and say math.enrollmentFull plus equals tab. And it creates the same kind of event handler or event listener. And we can copy and paste this. Let's start there and say enrollment is full for math. And you can say, well, that's not technically duplication because there's different values, but it really is duplication. So we're going to get to that, but we're going to first start here. So I just added a listener. That's all I did. And now I hit start. And now enrollment is full for math. Enrollment is full for history. So it fired for both of them. So that's how events work. It really comes down to just a few things. First of all, in the class that's going to fire off the events, you have to have an event handler. If you want to send data back, then you specify what type of data. In this case, I'm sending back string. and you give it a name. Then, in this same class, whenever this event should be to add a listener. So this is the event, and I added plus equal a listener. So why is it plus equal, not equal? And the reason why is because we can have more than one listener. We can have multiple listeners. So what we don't want to do is overwrite each one with the next one. We want to have a list of listeners, and then each one will get fired off. So if I had multiple methods here listening to the history enrollment full event, we can do that. Not a problem. We can have multiple methods in multiple different parts of our application even. And that's really why events are so powerful. WinForm lesson, which is in the next course. But in Windows Form, if you create a button and you double click it, and it creates a little bit of code that it looks a lot like that with the throw new not implement exception. If you go in the code and say, you know what, I don't want that, and you delete it, this is the error you're going to get. The problem is Windows Forms separates your class into two partial classes, and it hides one of them. But this is the error you're going to get because it's trying to add a method that it can't find. Because this is a method name. And since it can't find it, it says, I don't know what to do. This is not available anymore. Therefore, that's a design time error. What this does in Windows Forms is it makes the designer, the drag and drop designer, it makes it turn into a yellow screen of death. It says, hey, I can't even display your form. Oftentimes, that's a big error that causes problems for people, and it causes them to redo their entire application because they can't get around that error. Once you understand events, and this is why I teach that in this order, once you understand events, you go, oh, I deleted the event handler method, the event listener method, but I'm still saying I still added that method name to my event. Therefore, I would just delete this line and I'm good to go. Or update your method name if you just renamed it. And that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to being handled by the same method. And that's perfectly acceptable. And in fact, in a lot of ways, it's usually a good thing to do. Don't create 10 event listeners for practically the same thing. Create one and then just figure out how to make the differences visible. Now, sometimes you don't have the luxury of passing that string in. Maybe you need to pass the entire object in or something else. So how do you figure out if it's the math class or the history class that called you? Well, what we can do is, since we know that there's a college class model, we can say college class model So with that, that's a pretty brief, but yet at the same time, full-featured overview of how events work. Yes, there's a few pieces to it, but I really wanted to keep this as simple as possible to show you that events aren't really that scary. They're really powerful, but there's not a whole lot of moving parts to it. It's just getting a syntax where I have a couple pieces. The biggest one is make sure you have this glue piece in place. Start there, and then you just add your listener, and you also broadcast the change or the event, and that's it. Now the question may come up, when would you use events? And it really comes down to state change. Whenever any kind of state changes, and by state I mean the natural place or position of the object. So if, in this case, we maxed out a list, that's a pretty significant event in the life of this class, a maxed out list, because now things will be different. Maybe if you have certain things that occur, like you're processing records and you have an error show up. Maybe you don't want to throw an exception, but maybe you do want to indicate, hey, there was a record that we didn't fully process. And so you add to a list or whatever, but you could also fire off an event that tells the listener that. It just sits there. And then when a new record's been added, your class library fires an event that says, hey, the record's been added and here is that record. And all of a sudden you can then populate that on your UI, whether it's console or something else. So events, they're pretty powerful and they let others know about state change, whether it's one person or one listener or multiple. Your homework for today, create an event in a class and then consume that class. So attach a listener to the event and have it write to the console. That's all it's going to do. Pretty much what we did in this example, maybe a little bit different. And I would try and vary it just a little bit, but pretty close the same as what we just did. Just get used to the idea of firing events and listening to them and then doing something with that value. So that's the homework for today. Now, before we go, I do want to show you that I am going to move these things over to their own class files because that's kind of important to do. I don't want to forget about that. Okay, so remember your homework. I'll pull back up here. Get that homework done. Once you're done, then move on to the next lesson, which will be a project lesson to kind of bring some of these topics together and use them in a little bit more of a real world type example.